Well, hi there. This is Julian Humphrys, and I'm going to talk to you about the real Game of Thrones. I must say, I'm not the first person to call The Wars of the Roses the real Game of Thrones. It's quite a common comparison, but with good reason, actually, because when you look at The Wars of the Roses, it's got violence, it's got brutality, it's got treachery, it's got loyalty, it's got excitement, it's got all the things that we associate with the TV programme. So, actually, Real Game of Thrones is a pretty good description for it. Before I get started in talking about the Wars of the Roses, just a few things to bear in mind. First of all, it is the Wars of the Roses, not the War of the Roses. It's not a situation where we had 50 years of non-stop warfare. What you got actually were brief periods of intense brutality, and then between those, long periods of peace. So it was wars rather than a war. The other thing to say is that it wasn't Yorkshire versus Lancashire. You had the House of York, you had the House of Lancaster, but that didn't really have any kind of link to where those people came from. So, for example, oddly enough, the Lancastrians were quite strong in Yorkshire through much of the Wars of the Roses, and the Yorkists were particularly strong in the southeast and along the Welsh marches, around Ludlow, that sort of area. And the final thing to say is that if you'd said the Wars of the Roses to people at the time, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about, because the Wars of the Roses was a Victorian invention. It was something that was brought in later. And whilst it's true that the Yorkists, as you can see in this 19th century picture that's on the screen here, whilst the Yorkists did in fact use a white rose as one of their badges, the Lancastrians didn't use a red rose until the very end of the Wars of the Roses, when it was adopted by Henry Tudor, and you kind of feel that he adopted it so that he could combine it with the white rose of York to make the Tudor rose. So what caused the Wars of the Roses? Well, to a certain extent, I think we can see a lot of the origins of the wars in the character of the king at the start of the wars, and that was Henry VI, who became King of England as a baby when his warlike father, Henry V, dies on campaign. Now, Henry VI was everything that his father wasn't. Henry V was warlike, he was a good soldier, he was able to get his barons to fight for him, etc. Henry VI was none of those things. Really, he would have been better off being an abbot, I suppose, although even there I think he would have made a pretty bad job of it. And to make matters worse, he was prone to bouts of mental instability. His grandfather was Charles VI of France, and he too was prone to bouts of madness. And so Henry VI was a bit like that. He quite often descended into periods where he didn't say anything at all. And of course, at a time when you needed royal approval to do things, that made life a little bit difficult, to put it mildly. So in those circumstances, who is going to run the country? Who's going to take the lead? Well, interestingly, Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, was a quite forceful, pretty powerful character. She's sort of gone down in history as being a bit of a she-wolf, but I think we've got gender politics playing out here, because she displayed characteristics, I think, bravery, courage, determination, cruelty when necessary. These were all characteristics that one associated with men at the time, and the idea that a woman could do those things, I think people looked on it in a bit of an askance way. But in my opinion, she's quite an admirable character. Anyway, so she was one of the people who took the lead. But also, at that period where the king is mentally unstable, you need to have some kind of regent who's running the show. And of course, if you could be regent, it gave you immense power in the country, which you could perhaps wield to your own advantage, and certainly to your supporters' advantage. So whoever was regent was in a very strong position. Now, Henry VI, when he was perhaps in his more sane moments, and Margaret, there were two families that they tended to favour. First of all, the Suffolks, but later the Beauforts, the Dukes of Somerset, and they did very well out of their regencies. But this actually alienated other people in the country, and in particular Richard of York, who was the king's cousin. Now, he was a much more able administrator, a pretty brave soldier. He'd lost a lot of money in the 100 Years' War, but he, I think, felt that he should be the regent, and he looked askance at the situation when, for example, Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, was regent. Now, also, the Duke of York had a claim to the throne himself. In fact, it was better than that of Henry VI, because whereas Henry VI derived his claim through John of Gaunt, who was Edward III's third son, the Duke of York, Richard Duke of York, he could claim it both through his mother's side, Anne Mortimer, which went up to Edward III's second son, and his father's side when it went up to Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York, who was Edward III's fourth son. So he had a stronger claim to the throne. So there at the beginning of the 1450s, you've got a situation where you've got a weak king, prone to favouritism, and a powerful potential opponent who also has a claim to the throne. In other words, Richard of York. Well, this royal rivalry, I suppose you could call it, did have the potential for warfare. But to make matters perhaps worse was the fact that at a lower level in society, but at least amongst the baronage, there were rivalries as well. And perhaps one of the most notable was between the Nevilles, and perhaps the most famous of the Nevilles is Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the famous Warwick the Kingmaker, and the Percys. Percys were Earls of Northumberland. And you tended to get a situation where if the Nevilles took one side, the Percys would take the other. And so beneath that royal rivalry, you had these noble rivalries. And of course, with those nobles, they would bring with them their retainers and their supporters. And all of this was a bit of a powder keg. And it really first exploded in 1455. Now, in 1455, Richard of York had been excluded from the court. And this was quite worrying for him because, he didn't know what the royal court would do. Would they banish him? Would they strip him of titles, etc.? And so he took military action, and supported by the Nevilles, he mounted an attack on the royal court at this place. And some of you may be familiar with this tower. It's in St Albans, and it's a sort of separate bell tower that was built by the townspeople, really because they were fed up with St Albans Abbey, which was powerful and kind of hoovered up all the money. So they built their own bell tower as a sort of up yours to the Abbey. Well, one of the really fascinating things about this tower is that it's still got the bell in it that was there at the time of the Wars of the Roses. It was called Gabriel. And so whenever it rings, you're hearing the sound that the people that fought in the Wars of the Roses would have heard. And it certainly sounded in 1455 when Richard of York and his allies, the Nevilles, attacked the royal court at St Albans. It was really a personal attack, I would say, on the supporters of Henry VI. It wasn't really aimed at the king, but the people that were killed in the battle were the Earl of Northumberland, an enemy of the Nevilles, Lord Clifford, a supporter of the Earl of Northumberland, therefore an enemy of the Nevilles, and finally the Duke of Somerset. A bit of a story about the Duke of Somerset here. It is said, which normally when you hear that it means it's probably not true, but it's a good story, so we're going to tell it anyway. But it is said that a soothsayer told the Duke of Somerset that he would die on the steps of a castle. Well, he must have thought things would be okay at St Albans because there isn't a castle there. But as the battle turned against his men, he was forced to take refuge in a nearby tavern. And I think you can probably guess what's going to come now. Anyway, he got into the tavern, they probably slammed the door, and he probably sort of said to the landlord, "Well, what's the name of your of your tavern?" Chap comes back with, "It be the castle." And sure enough, he's killed on the steps of the castle in St Albans. So victory for the Yorkists. Things do actually calm down for a while, but what it does do, this attack at St Albans, is it opens up a period really of revenge and reprisal, because now you've got the sons of those people who were killed by the Yorkists at St Albans, so the Percys, the Cliffords and the Beauforts, who are looking for revenge. But as I say, things calm down for a while, but then in 1460 fighting breaks out again, and the Yorkists, Neville, Richard Duke of York and so on, they're able to capture Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton. Here's a picture of it. A couple of interesting things to see in this picture. I think the first is the gun in the foreground. This is a period where artillery is beginning to become important. the Lancastrian camp at Northampton was a fortified camp with guns all round it. But they came to grief partly because it rained, but partly because some of their soldiers in true Game of Thrones style changed sides and let the Yorkists into the camp. Anyway, they captured Henry VI, but they weren't at this stage seeking to replace him. And as you can see in this picture, the victorious Yorkists are kneeling down before the king, who interestingly is in armour. I frankly don't think that Henry VI ever put armour on, but there we are. Quite a good picture here by Graham Turner. So for the time being, you've got a situation where the king is under the control of the Yorkists. But the problem was that Richard of York realised that so long as the king had his wife and her adherents and his own supporters, it was only a matter of time before he ran into trouble again. And so he took quite a dramatic step. The lords were meeting in London, and Richard strode into the room where they were, and he claimed the throne. Now, I don't know what Richard thought was going to happen. I don't know if he thought that there was going to be great cheers and acclamation for him. But in fact, what there was an embarrassed silence. Because although everybody realised, I think, that Richard would have been a better king than Henry VI, a better governor of the country, a better soldier, and so on, they had sworn an oath of allegiance to their anointed king, Henry VI. And it was something that was very difficult to put aside. And so, in the end, they came to a kind of compromise. And the compromise was that Henry VI would remain king, but Richard would replace him as king when he died. Or if Richard had died, his offspring would become king. Now, most people in the country would settle for that. So they dealt with the problem of putting Henry VI aside, but they could see a better sort of future, I suppose you could say. But there was one person that was having none of it, and that was Margaret of Anjou. And the reason why Margaret would have none of it was because she had a son. Somehow she and Henry VI had managed to have a child, and Margaret would not see that child be disinherited. She thought it was her son's right to succeed to the throne, and she wasn't having that right put aside in favour of Richard of York and his offspring. And so she raised an army to fight Richard. It was very much a northern army. She got Scottish support, and she got Scottish support by handing over Berwick to them. Now, Berwick was a very important border fortress up in the northeast, so to hand it over was quite an extreme measure. She also gave them Carlisle, but since Carlisle was in Yorkist hands, that didn't mean very much. It was basically a case of, well, you can have Carlisle if you can capture it. But with that army, she marched south, and at Wakefield in Yorkshire, Richard of York literally gave battle in vain. We don't know what went on exactly, but he was spending December 1460 in Sandal Castle, just outside of Wakefield, and the Lancastrian army arrived outside. And for some reason, Richard and his forces came out of the castle, and they seem to have been ambushed. And whatever happened, Richard was surrounded by his enemies, and he was killed on the battlefield. And it wasn't just Richard of York who was killed. One of his sons, the Earl of Rutland, was killed, and the leader of the Neville faction at the time, who was the Earl of Salisbury, was also killed. So a massive defeat for the Yorkists. But things weren't over for them, because one person who wasn't at the battle, who therefore took over the leadership of the Yorkists, was Richard of York's son, Edward of March, later Edward IV. Now, he was everything, again, that Henry VI wasn't. He was a powerful man. He was supposed to have been 6'4". He seemed to have a lot of charm about him. He was very bold. He was a good soldier. He was attractive to women. He was one of those blokes that men wanted to be and women wanted to be with, you could say. And he took over the Yorkist cause. And he very soon won a victory at Mortimers Cross, which was near to Ludlow. And it was an unusual battle because it was fought in the winter of 1461. And it was very cold, and there was a parhelion in the sky. Now, a parhelion is where ice crystals reflect the sun, and it looks like there are three suns in the sky. And according to the chroniclers, the Lancastrians were filled with dismay and fear when they see this, whereas Edward IV is supposed to have said something along the lines of, "Aha, 'tis proof that the Holy Trinity is on our side." Well, what I know about Edward IV, I don't think that religion was very much to the forefront in his mind. So either somebody whispered it in his ear to say this, or it was written afterwards to perhaps make him into a bit more of a godly person. But whatever the reality, he was a good leader. And at the Battle of Mortimers Cross, he defeated the Lancastrians, and he moved over to London, where he was acclaimed King Edward IV by his Yorkist supporters. What had happened was that the Lancastrians, under Margaret of Anjou, the new Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and others, had marched south after their victory at Wakefield. But on the way, they had looted and pillaged, probably had little choice, because where are they going to get their food from? But all these sort of terrible rumours about these wild northerners coming south had reached London. And when the Lancastrians got to London, the city wouldn't let them in. So they were stuck in a situation where, what are they to do? So they decided to fall back to their heartland, which was the north of England and Yorkshire in particular, and that's what they did. So they headed back up north, where they were followed by Edward IV, the new Edward IV, who linked up with the Earl of Warwick, and a third supporter of the Yorkists, the Duke of Norfolk, came up from East Anglia with his contingent. And on Palm Sunday, 1461, a horrendous battle was fought outside of York at Towton. Some people say it was the bloodiest battle to be fought on English soil. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but certainly at the time, contemporaries were quite shocked by the violence, the number of people that were killed in this battle. The battle was fought in a blizzard, but it was the Yorkists that came out on top, and there was to be no mercy after this battle. And after what had happened at the Battle of Wakefield, where Edward IV's father had been killed, Richard of York, he ordered that there should be no mercy, and so the Lancastrians were cut down in their droves. That wasn't to be the end of that period of fighting, though. So Edward IV had won the battle. Henry VI and the remnants of his defeated army retreated up to the northeast. But it was still to be about 3 years of campaigning by Edward IV, the Earl of Warwick, and Warwick's brother, Montague, to subdue the Lancastrians. And a lot of this was involved siege warfare. And a number of the great castles up in the northeast, places like Alnwick and Dunstanburgh and Warkworth, were captured by the Yorkists. Sometimes they then declared back for the Lancastrians again, so it was quite a lot of siege warfare. And one of the places that was captured during all of this was Bamborough Castle, and Bamborough Castle has gone down in history as the first major English castle to be battered into submission by artillery, by gunpowder artillery, because the Yorkists, when they were laying siege to Bamborough, they summoned up the guns from London. These were great big sort of bombards, and they had interesting names like Newcastle and Dijon and Edward, etc. They were great big things that could batter down walls. Now, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was responsible for the siege here, and he didn't want to destroy the walls of Bamborough Castle, mainly because they realised it was an important place, and they wanted to be able to use it in case the Scots should invade at a later date. And it said that he sent a message in to Grey, who was the garrison commander, and it basically said, well, we could batter the walls down, but we don't want to because we need to keep the castle intact. And so for every ball that hits the walls, one of the heads of one of your garrison will be removed. Well, apparently Grey kept quiet about this and didn't tell anybody, and he held out. But gradually the castle started to get damaged more and more, and his garrison were getting a little bit twitchy. You know, what would happen if the castle stormed? But Grey refused to surrender. But then he was in his chamber, and one of the cannonballs hit the roof, and a lot of the roof fell in, and it knocked him out. And when he came round, he found that his garrison had surrendered, and he was carted off and duly beheaded. Now, Edward IV wasn't actually involved in this, because he was involved in a campaign of his own, and the campaign of his own that he was involved in was wooing Elizabeth Woodville, who he secretly married. Now, this was to cause Edward a few political problems. The main problem was that he'd relied very heavily upon the support of Warwick the Kingmaker, Richard Neville of Warwick. Warwick had provided him with money and men, and was one of the richest men in the country. And perhaps unsurprisingly, he expected to be consulted in matters of state. And one of the things that he was trying to do was to arrange a foreign marriage for Edward IV with a foreign princess, which would then help with sorting out some kind of alliance, if you see what I mean. But so he was going through this, and you can imagine that the situation at court where he was sort of talking about what he was going to do, and he said, well, your Majesty, I've got this plan for you to marry so-and-so. And then Edward IV had to say, well, actually, Richard, I better come clean about this. I'm already married. What? Imagine everybody at court astounded by this. Well, who are you married to? Well, I'm married to Elizabeth Woodville. Well, that in itself was a bit of an outrage, because the Woodvilles were a fairly lowly family. They weren't one of the sort of top-notch aristocratic families. So, the idea of the king marrying a Woodville was considered to be a bit off, But to make matters worse, it wasn't just Elizabeth Woodville, but she had a vast number of relatives. And all of these relatives needed to be found marriages now that they were related, they were the in-laws of the king. They got all the good jobs at court. As I say, they hoovered up the marriages. And until then, it had been the Nevilles that had been doing that. And so you got this enmity between the Woodvilles and, by definition, I suppose, Edward IV and Richard Neville. And so Warwick the Kingmaker, who for years had been Edward's staunchest supporter, became his opponent. And there was a period at the end of the 1460s where you got more fighting in the country, where Warwick the Kingmaker first tried to control Edward IV and get rid of the Woodvilles, but when he realised that wasn't possible, he decided that the only thing he could do was to replace him. Now, who do you replace him with? Well, it so happened that Henry VI was still alive. He was a pathetic shadow of a man in the Tower of London, but he was still there. And Warwick the Kingmaker entered into an extraordinary alliance, really of convenience, with Margaret of Anjou, his old enemy. And what they did was join forces, force Edward IV into exile to Belgium, he went to Bruges, and get poor Henry out of the Tower of London, and they made him king again. So you got a period that was known as the readaptation, where Henry VI was on the throne, but really he was no more than a puppet of the Nevilles. But Edward IV wasn't the kind of man to take that lying down. He came back to the country, raised an army, and at Barnet in 1471, he defeated and killed Warwick the Kingmaker in a really confused battle that was fought in the fog. And he went on then, and he defeated the forces of Margaret of Anjou at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now, this was a particularly important battle because it wasn't just a defeat, but Margaret of Anjou's son, Edward, Prince of Wales, the person that she'd gone to war on behalf of in the first place, in order to secure his inheritance, he was killed in the battle or put to death afterwards. And really, that wiped out the Lancastrian chances. The Yorkists hadn't executed or murdered Henry VI prior to this, because had they done so, his son, the Prince of Wales, would have become the Lancastrian leader, and he would have been a much better leader. But now that he was dead, really Henry VI's days were numbered, and he was quietly put to death in the Tower of London. So to all intents and purposes, by 1471, the Yorkists had won the Wars of the Roses, and Edward IV would rule unchallenged for another decade. Perhaps it's worth looking now at Edward IV's household, his immediate supporters, his affinity, the people through whom he ruled. Now, who were they? Well, for a while there was George, Duke of Clarence, who was his brother, but George, Duke of Clarence was unreliable, to put it mildly. He'd nearly joined Warwick the Kingmaker in his attempt to unseat his brother years before, and he was always prone to his own plots and schemes, and in the end, actually, Edward IV lost patience with him and had him executed. According to Shakespeare, he was drowned in a butt of wine, but whether that was the case or not, I don't know. Edward IV's great friend was William Hastings. Hastings was not just his comrade in arms, he was his drinking partner. They used to go wenching together. They were great friends. You then had the Woodvilles themselves, with a large number of people that perhaps owed their position to Edward. So you had the Woodvilles, and Elizabeth Woodville had two children, Edward and Richard. Edward would be heir to the throne. And then you had Edward IV's brother, Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III. Now, at this stage, there was no possibility, I think, of Richard III hoping to take the throne. You hear that in Shakespeare, but this is a dramatic license. It's pretty clear that Richard III's colours were very firmly nailed to the Edward IV mast, and there we are. But all of this would change in 1483 when Edward IV died suddenly. You've now got his son, Edward V, to succeed him. But Edward V was very much, I think, under the influence of the Woodvilles. And this worried people, and it particularly worried Richard of Gloucester and William Hastings. And Richard in 1483, with Hastings' support, that he launched a coup, really. And it was to take over as protector of the realm. So he wasn't at this stage trying to replace Edward V as king or murder him or anything like that. It was purely that he would be the regent of the country. Well, the two princes, so Edward and Richard, eventually were sent to the Tower of London. Now, it's important to realise that there was nothing necessarily sinister about this at the time. It was a palace, and it was the traditional place where monarchs went before they were crowned. So it wasn't like some grim prison where you're going to certainly be murdered. It wasn't that at all. Well, then something changes. One of the first hints of this, I think, is that at a council meeting, Richard accuses William Hastings, Edward IV's old friend, of treason and has him, without trial, executed. And then an extraordinary thing happens. A sermon is preached at St. Paul's by a cleric, and in this sermon, it's said that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous because he'd been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Eleanor Talbot, and in those days it was said that a pre-contract was equivalent to a wedding. That meant that the wedding to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous. That meant that the two children, Edward V, the future Edward V, and Richard, his brother, were illegitimate, therefore they could not inherit the crown. Now, if they were illegitimate and couldn't inherit the crown, who can? Richard of Gloucester, and he is acclaimed and later crowned Richard III. Why did he do this? Well, perhaps it's true. Perhaps it is true that they were illegitimate. Or perhaps more likely, he did it because he needed to secure his future and that of his own son. And there's no doubt, reading the sources, I think, that the young Edward V and his brother were very much children of the Woodvilles. And when they'd grown up, and it wouldn't have been that long after this that they would have come of age, there's a very strong possibility that they would have favoured the Woodvilles at the expense of Richard III. And so perhaps it was a defensive measure on the part of Richard III. He had nothing to do with ambition at all. But whatever he became, he was crowned king, and eventually nothing is heard of the princes in the Tower anymore. So what happened to them? Well, were they murdered? If so, by whom? Well, lot of ink has been spilt arguing about this. We know what Shakespeare thinks, that it's Richard III. Ricardians cannot believe that their hero would be capable of such a thing. Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they weren't murdered at all. Perhaps one of them died. Perhaps one of them escaped or was spirited away. Well, we'll never know for sure. But what I think is significant is that a number of people at the time thought that they'd been murdered, and the finger of suspicion pointed very firmly at Richard III, as in my opinion it still does today, but we'll never know, I think, for sure. So in seizing the throne, Richard had really destroyed the old Yorkist establishment. Hastings was dead. The Woodvilles were now opponents. Many of the people that had been in Edward IV's household were horrified by what he'd done, and so there was no longer this united Yorkist household. And this did enable one person to come completely out of left field, and that was the son of a woman called Lady Margaret Beaufort, who had royal blood, and her son was a chap called Henry Tudor. And of course, the rest is history. Well, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was shaky, to put it mildly. Okay, his mother had a certain amount of royal blood in her, but his father, a Tudor, had none. What he did do, though, is he got a lot of support from disgruntled Yorkists, and he promised to marry Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, once he'd seized the throne. And that was really as far as it went. So much of the people that fought for him, perhaps they fought against Richard rather than for Henry Tudor. He didn't have much of an army when he landed in Wales. I mean, a lot of it, in fact, the bulk of it, when he landed, was supplied by the French. He hired a lot of French mercenaries to be the sort of key part of his army. There was a few old Lancastrians. The Earl of Oxford, who was a long-standing Lancastrian who'd fought at the Battle of Barnet many years before, came to command his vanguard. And he was joined by few troops as he went through England and Wales, but not many. Richard also found it difficult to get nobles and men to turn out for him. I think that people have got a bit wise to these things, and they wanted to keep their heads down, and it was more a case of just waiting to see what happened before committing themselves. But nevertheless, Richard managed to put together an army that was considerably larger than that of Henry Tudor, and they based themselves at Leicester before going out to a place called Sutton Cheney near Market Bosworth, where the final great battle would be fought. Richard had with him the Earl of Northumberland, he had the Duke of Norfolk, and also present on that day was the Stanley family. Now, the Stanleys have gone down in history as the sort of archetypal fence-sitters, the turncoats that betrayed Richard. But I think if you look at the accounts and read what had happened, and think about the fact, for example, that by this stage Margaret Beaufort was married to a Stanley, it was pretty clear which side they would be fighting on, i.e. the Tudor side. And it wasn't a matter of if they fought at the battle, it was when. So what do we know about the battle itself? Well, not a great deal, actually, but there are one or two salient facts that do come out. The first is that in the initial fighting, the Tudor vanguard under the Earl of Oxford, partly French, partly English, partly Welsh, drove back the vanguard of Richard's army, which was under the Duke of Norfolk. For some reason, the Earl of Northumberland never committed himself to the battle, and so it looks as though things were going badly for Richard. But at one moment in the battle, he spotted Henry Tudor and his bodyguard sort of separate from everybody, and Richard was always one to sort of go for it if he had the opportunity, and he reckoned that if he could charge down and kill Henry Tudor on the battlefield, well, that would be it. Everything would be over. It didn't matter what happened in the rest of the fighting. And so, with his entourage, his bodyguard of knights, they launched what was really the last great medieval charge in English history across the battlefield in an attempt to kill Henry Tudor. And they nearly carried it off. Richard, who we now know he had scoliosis, he was not a powerful man, but he seems to have been a pretty able soldier, and he personally killed Henry Tudor's standard bearer, a chap called Brandon. And he went on and unhorsed a man called Sir John Cheney. Now, Cheney was a giant of a man. He's buried in the Salisbury Cathedral, and when they moved the tomb once, they did some measurements, and they thought he was well over 6 foot, 6'4", that sort of size. But nevertheless, Richard unhorsed him. But that was as far as he was able to get. And by that time, it looks as though the Stanleys had intervened on the battle on behalf of Henry Tudor. And so the game was up for Richard. Stuck up against a marsh, it seems, he was cut down. And even chroniclers who were very anti-Richard later admitted that he died, fighting bravely in the midst of his enemies. Richard is dead. Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII. Henry will still have to fight to hold on to his crown. 2 years later, he's challenged by a force of disgruntled Yorkists, I suppose you could say, who rally behind a pretender called Lambert Simnel. But they come to a sticky end outside of Newark at a place called Wakefield. And that really was the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry's victory at Wakefield really meant that he had won the real Game of Thrones. He had won the Wars of the Roses.
Hi, my name is Mia. I'm the acting programme lead at A Space Arts. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and if you can spare a few pennies for GHT, please follow the link in the description below to donate to our PayPal account. The money you donate will help support the organisation through this difficult time and allow us to continue developing content like this to keep us all entertained at home. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking here and hitting subscribe, and you can watch more quality content from GHT by clicking here. Thanks again everybody, and stay safe.